Welcome everyone to the Australia and New Zealand School of Government National Regulators Community of Practice webinar series. Before we commence, we have participants from all over the world at this webinar, so I would like to begin by acknowledging First Peoples from all countries and pay my respect to them. We honour their wisdom and their stewardship of traditional lands and customs which enrich all of us. Welcome to you all. I'm Dr. Chris Walker, Associate Dean of the Australia and New Zealand School of Government, and I'm also the Academic Director of our Executive Masters of Public Administration. And I also am a member of the New South Wales National Regulators Community of Practice. So I'm very delighted to be here today to facilitate our webinar, which brings together two very vital questions for today's audience. What's the public value of what we do as regulators? And secondly, how do we measure and communicate this? Before I introduce our speakers, I'd just like to touch on some housekeeping issues. For colleagues who may have missed today, all the NRCOP webinars are recorded and available on the NSOG YouTube channel within 14 days. The slides from today will also be available on the NRCOP webpage, plus a recent article from BehaviourWorks Australia providing an overview of the many different ways people are going about defining and measuring public value will be on our website. And I will mention this article later on in the discussion. So now to introduce my speakers. It's a great pleasure to introduce our panel speakers today, both of whom are alumni of ANZSOG's Executive Masters of Public Administration. They are two shining examples of our alumni taking the idea of delivering public value to heart and going and doing amazing things in public and public purpose sectors. Our first speaker today is Emily Saunders. Emily is the Director of Regulation at the Victorian Commission for Children and Young People, and she's looking after the administration of the Reportable Conduct Scheme and Child Safe Standards. She has a background in law and has previous experience working at regulators including the Environment Protection Authority and the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation. She also has policy experience in law enforcement and youth justice. Our second speaker today is Tony Keenan. Tony is the General Manager, Wellbeing and Inclusion at the City of Port Phillip. There he leads a range of areas, quite extensive. It includes housing, homelessness, Indigenous programs, aged care, childcare and family services, diversity and open spaces. He's very busy. His previous roles included the CEO of Launch Housing and its predecessor, Hanover Welfare Services. Tony was the Director of the Australian Foyer Foundation and he was a past President of the Australian Federation of AIDS Organisations. I'd now like to briefly discuss some ideas and issues about our topic concerning public value before I hand over to our speakers. I regularly teach on this topic and I work in executive education with senior executives exploring the application of public value in practice. And I also currently supervise a PhD student who is grappling with how to use public value as a means for measuring the value of the technology and the applied research output of the university sector. So my experience demonstrates that issues of designing and delivering and measuring public value are of great interest to public sector managers as well as researchers and academics. Here at ANZSOG, the importance of public value forms the foundation of our Executive Masters of Public Administration, and it is a thematic spine throughout the program. So we have a great interest in learning and researching how senior practitioners experience and apply public value in public sector. Public value also is of significance for Australia. The Harvard academic Mark Moore, who developed the idea of public value, published his first articulation of public value in the Australian Journal of Public Administration in 1994. This was then followed by his book in 1995, Creating Public Value. So the concept Mark has further developed with subsequent books in 2013, Recognising Public Value. And throughout this period, Mark Moore has been working with Australian governments, and he has been extensively involved with ANZSOG and scholars at ANZSOG such as Professor Janino Flynn and John Alford. And the research and the work has looked at how we might teach and better achieve public value across the Australian public sector. We know that public value is created by services, laws, regulations, and other actions that derive from a level of directed activity by public sector managers. This may also involve co-producers. This could be public agencies, non-government agencies, or private sector agencies. And the effect of this directed activity gives value to the public. I work with a colleague who describes public value as the big idea in public administration and leadership. And central to the concept of public value is the strategic triangle. This involves three core elements: operational feasibility, how do we use the resources and the skills that we have to deliver value; the authorising environment, the political context of stakeholders and authority that lends legitimacy to actions that public sector agencies and collaborative agencies may undertake; and then the derived value that comes from this coordinated action for communities. So these elements for public sector managers have an intuitive appeal. They resonate with our experience, and theoretically this seems like a robust model. The argument is that public managers are actively managing and responding to these three issues, calibrating their programs and services to address these essential elements. So public activity and delivering public value, therefore, is essentially different. It is much more complex and more dynamic than simply managing and delivering profitable and efficient services. But how do regulators do this? How do they know they are achieving and delivering public value? And what do we measure to determine the quantum of public value derived from regulatory activity? These are core and essential questions for our audience today, and I'm hoping that our panel can give us an insight to some of the challenges of working with these issues. Very briefly, I mentioned some of the research that from the Behaviour Works, which is available on our website. And I'd just like to refer to the work by the Monash academic Nick Faulkner and Stefan Kaufman from the Victorian EPA. They reviewed over 500 articles that looked at public value and measuring public value over a 20-year period. And from that body of work, they identified a subsequent 19 articles that were ultimately concerned with looking at methodological approaches for measuring public value. And from those 19 articles, they distilled that down to 4 key themes that would give some robust form of measurement for public value. And these concerned outcome achievement, trust and legitimacy, service delivery and quality, and efficiency. Now, I'm aware that Emily will speak briefly to these in the applied context, so I won't go any further, but we do get a sense that even these 4 elements pose some challenges in terms of measurement. So how do we operationalize a measurement framework and practically apply it? This is a challenge. And as the explanatory statement for this webinar said, regulatory agencies diligently report on activity, things like the number of inspections, the number of prosecutions. But are these satisfactory measures? And do they go to the heart of what regulatory agencies really do? When we come to define our public value, we are really thinking about dimensions like the 4 measures I mentioned earlier. Worthwhile outcomes such as trust and legitimacy, acting fairly, delivering well on behalf of citizens, and using public resources wisely. These things are much harder to measure, and they're much harder to measure than simply the number of improvement notices issued by an agency. So how are thoughtful regulators grappling with the dimensions of analysing their public value and telling a public value story to the community? Well, that's a challenge for our panel speakers, and it's time for us to hear from them. I'd now like to hand over to Emily to discuss her experiences and insights.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm standing on today. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. Today, I'll be talking about the Commission's regulatory functions in the area of institutional child abuse. I'm also going to dust off the strategic triangle to help define the Commission's public value. And I'm going to discuss our progress in measuring our public value and telling our story as a regulator. Before I start, I just want to let you know that I'll be speaking about the prevention of child abuse. This can be a challenging topic for some in our community. I won't be going into any details about cases, and I encourage you to do what you need to keep yourself safe. So the Commission for Children and Young People is a Victorian independent statutory authority, and we've been around since about 2013. We have a focus on vulnerable children and young people, and our work includes providing independent scrutiny and oversight for children and young people, particularly those in out-of-home care, in child protection and in youth justice. We also advocate for best practice policy program and service responses to meet the needs of children and young people. As an organisation, we substantially changed though in 2017. We were provided with new regulatory functions and had to develop our role as a regulator. The regulatory task we were given was to work to prevent institutional child abuse. We received some funding, we doubled our staffing, and we were provided with some powers. The two regulatory schemes we took on were the Child Safe Standards and the Reportable Conduct Scheme. Regulated organisations are required to implement the Child Safe Standards so that their systems best act to prevent child abuse and ensure an appropriate response should allegations arise. The standards focus on policies, processes and organisational culture. They relate to abuse in organisations, not abuse in the home. Some of the things organisations must have under the standards are screening processes for their staff and volunteers, codes of conduct and child abuse reporting and response procedures. The large number of regulated organisations, about 60,000, and the sheer diversity of these organisations makes it a challenge. The standards apply to small footy and netball clubs, hospitals, churches, synagogues and mosques, as well as government departments, to name but a few. In 2017, the Commission also took on the Reportable Conduct Scheme. There are about 12,500 organisations that have to notify the Commission of allegations of child abuse and related misconduct by any of their workers or volunteers. Now, these organisations also have to go on to investigate these allegations and tell the Commission about their findings. We oversee these investigations and provide advice and guidance. So in this function, we're actually regulating investigatory practice. If an allegation is substantiated, we share this with the Working with Children Check Unit, amongst other regulators, to support them making decisions about whether that person should continue to work with children. The legislation for both of these schemes focuses a lot of the Commission's efforts on providing advice and guidance to assist organisations to comply. Like other regulators that I'm sure who are tuned in today, we've committed to risk-based regulation and responsive regulation. We have a published regulatory approach which guides our strategy, operations and decision-making. A key part of our philosophy is that in many instances we can bring about compliance through education and support, with more significant sanctions to be used for organisations that are uncooperative or have repeated or serious failings in compliance, or where greater harm or significant risk of harm to children has been identified. Now, child abuse prevention is a busy regulatory space. We are one of a number of regulators with a role in enforcing the standards in Victoria. There are also other organisations like Child Protection, Victoria Police and the Victorian Institute of Teaching who also have important roles. Now that you know the Commission a little better, I wanted to share some thoughts on defining and measuring public value in the Commission's context, looking at our regulatory task in particular. Just a reminder of the very useful strategic triangle which Chris took us through before. It's such a great tool to assist us public managers in undertaking our duties. In putting this talk together, it was great to refresh my thinking on this and how useful it can be to problem solve. So I'm going to talk through aspects of the strategic triangle as they currently apply to the Commission. And this will assist me to share my thinking about the tricky task of telling our public value story to the community. ANZSOG's website has got a great little piece on public value, and it presents these short questions using the strategic triangle, which I find quite helpful. The first question being, should I do it? Meaning, is there public value in the task? May I do it? Do you have the authorising environment? Followed by, can I do it? Do you have the productive capabilities? And for the purposes of today's presentation, I offer a further question. How can I demonstrate that I actually did it? How do I measure the public value? There is a really good reason to measure your public value. It helps the authorising environment to perceive the value being produced and maintains your legitimacy as a regulator. So to start with the authorising environment, it's certainly a critical part of how the Commission has defined its public value. It helps to look to the relevant minister and the government when asking yourself the question, may I do it? Do I have the authorising environment? In the case of independent regulators, I think it's also particularly important to look further afield to check you have the requisite authorising environment. You might find you still have some work to do to build your case for action. An important part of the Commission's authorising environment has been two widely reported independent inquiries on child abuse, which gathered the views of many in our community and focused them into clear recommendations for action. In 2013, the Victorian Parliament's Family and Community Development Committee tabled its final report from the inquiry into the handling of child abuse by religious and non-government organisations. This report then led to the adoption of the Child Safe Standards and Reportable Conduct Scheme in Victoria, with the Commission administering these regulatory schemes. Then, of course, the Royal Commission into Institutional Child Sexual Abuse released its final report in late 2017, and it recommended these two regulatory schemes be adopted Australia-wide. Some jurisdictions have aspects of what the Royal Commission recommended. New South Wales, for example, has had a reportable conduct scheme for about 20 years now. Individual states and territories are progressing their responses to the Royal Commission's recommendations, so we'll see where this ends up in a national sphere. In the short time available, I won't be able to do justice to what was exposed in the Royal Commission. I'm sure we all recall the media reporting throughout the hearings. Organisation after organisation that was found to have put their own interests ahead of children and young people. Evidence was unearthed of cover-ups and decades upon decades of abuse in institutions. People in authority who knew and did not act to protect children and young people or to hold perpetrators to account. The most wicked of long-term market failures was identified in our institutions. Recommendations were made for regulators to be empowered to address this unacceptable level of harm in the community. The CEO of the Royal Commission left us with these words when delivering the final report. We have now completed our work. It's up to governments and institutions to take the next steps. The Royal Commission and Victorian Parliamentary Inquiry and the thousands of survivors who shared their stories could not have done a better job of creating an authorising environment for the Commission's work. So important are these two inquiries to the Commission's regulatory functions, they are integrated into our documented regulatory approach. They have also provided us with invaluable evidence of the circumstances in which abuse occurs and have assisted our understanding of risk to help in our risk-based approach. These two inquiries sit alongside our legislation in being a clear determinant of the public value we pursue. It's a big piece of work to undo many countless decades, perhaps centuries of organisational culture that led to the large-scale abuse of children that we have seen. Some of the organisations we regulate, religious organisations for example, are thousands of years old. The question we're told to ask ourselves in looking at our operational capability to deliver public value is, can we do it? We are a relatively small regulator with a massive task. While some regulated organisations have been quick to respond, we know it will unfortunately take time to bring all of the regulated organisations up to the requisite standard. A great number of those we regulate want to do the right thing. Some just need some guidance. But of course, we also have some who are unwilling. But we have legal authority and we have lots and lots of willing co-producers. It may take some time, but I reckon we can do it. And so to the question of, should we do it? What is the public value the Commission should be producing? The legislative objectives and principles that guide the work of the Commission help us identify our public value. These include to serve the public interest by promoting the safety of children, the prevention of child abuse, the proper response to allegations of child abuse, improving organisations' ability to investigate reportable allegations. And we have a fundamental principle that guides us, which is that the protection of children is the paramount consideration in the context of child abuse or employee misconduct involving a child. Now, I like to summarise these into two very high-level outcomes that are on the slide, an expression of the public value we seek to produce. What sits underneath this are lots of small outcomes, step changes, things that can be delivered and achieved in the next few years. Preventing child abuse across 60,000 organisations we regulate is a long-term goal. I think unless you can also break your public value task down to some achievable chunks, it can be hard to see your progress, hard to tell if you're making a difference, and also to tell your story to maintain your authorising environment. So Chris has already mentioned this article from Faulkner and Kaufman looking at public value measurement and what's been written in the literature. These four domains that they came up with in considering this for the purposes of this talk, I thought, yeah, they feel pretty right to me. 3 years into administering this new child abuse prevention regulatory system, I can tell you we are not yet measuring to this level of sophistication though. My experience tells me we are delivering across all 4 of these domains, but I can't yet show you we are. But we are collecting some useful data, we are measuring some useful things, and we are setting ourselves targets. We have also worked out ways to tell parts of our story to the public while still following the statutory confidentiality provisions that apply to a lot of our work. I know in June, Dr. Claire Noon and Gerard Brody presented a session that posed this question for regulators. How do we know we're good at what we do? As a brand new regulator with a brand new regulatory system, I think the first questions to ask yourself are, how do we know we're doing it, i.e. generating public value? And then how do we demonstrate to the public we're doing it? Then you can start to refine and move to looking at how well you're doing it. When you're starting out as a regulator, a fair amount of effort needs to go into learning about the problem you're there to solve and working out your strategy. The Commission made an early decision to build a database to help us manage our work. We also prioritised recruiting a data analyst and ensuring she received appropriate software. Not only has this helped us manage the approximately 900 notifications of alleged abuse we receive annually, but we can also use the data we collect to analyse the child abuse problem and publicly report on it. We publish quite a lot of aggregated data about child abuse allegations. Publicly reporting data about child abuse creates transparency, and this was something the Royal Commission said was sorely lacking in our institutions. It also helps the public and also those that we regulate understand the problem. It can be hard to show the good work you're doing unless there is some data demonstrating what the problem is. Collecting and publishing this data means we can say with certainty, child abuse is not just a problem from the past, it happens today. Preventing child abuse requires behaviour and attitudinal change across a significant part of the community. Now, given the scale of the child abuse problem, it will likely take some time for our work at the Commission to show up in a statistically significant way. In the meantime, we can share case studies where we have made a difference. We can also gather and share themes if we're seeing some common issues that we want to highlight. In limited circumstances, we can also publish details about organisations with systemic issues with compliance. As I've said, new regulators have a lot to do. They need to raise awareness of new laws. They need to help organisations understand what they need to do to comply. They have to work out their regulatory strategy and they have to establish relationships. And regulators don't always have significant resources for the task of measurement. Having an eye to where you want to end up with measurement is a good idea. I suggest conducting investment logic mapping or a similar activity early in the life of the regulator to connect you very clearly with your outcomes. This helps you to identify what you'd like to measure and gives you good structure to your measurement efforts. But you may not be able to capture all relevant data at the start. You also may not have the resources and time to set up all the proper counting rules, the validation, and the regular reporting. For some regulators, it may be more manageable and sustainable to start with some measures. Get these first measures right and then add to them over time. Like anything, to succeed and be useful, measurement requires the right cultural settings within your organisation. You also need to allow for learning. I suspect that it's not until you spend some time with those that you regulate and those that you're trying to protect that you start to really understand what's possible in the way of public value, given your operational capability and your authorising environment. You need the experience of using your powers, seeing what works, what doesn't work, which regulatory tools work to solve your problem, and whether you have indeed the right regulatory tools. When something goes well and you know you've made a difference, acknowledge this internally. See if you can figure out a way to record when you do this, how often it happens. Can you identify when it doesn't happen? The last thing I would say is, yes, measurement and transparency is vitally important. It helps build trust and makes you a more effective regulator. But it is also important to be able to step away from the numbers and the measurement and make sure you are not losing sight of actually delivering the outcomes for people. I'll leave it there, Chris.
I really like the point you made about raising how we do it. And I think there's some issues that we might follow up when we move to the discussion. And also this idea of know, demonstrate, and know how well you're doing it. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And the final point that you had there about small regulators, because I noticed on the Slido, we've got some questions about how small regulators participate. So great, thanks again for raising those issues. So it's now time for something completely different. And I'd like to ask Tony Keenan to share his perspectives.
I too would like to commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Traditional owners of where I'm presenting from are Wurundjeri, and for the city of Port Phillip are Boon Wurrung, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So this is completely different perspective from local government, and I've called it regulating with the kiddie toolbox because we have in local government we have quite a different context, and whilst we still do regulation, we have to rely on quite different tools to do it. So like a good ANZOG alumni, I went back to my notes, and in the fantastic unit called Governing by the Rules, I think it's still called that, but presented and led by Professor Ari Freiberg, he presented two, I think, fairly useful definitions of regulation, which I think helps set the context for this presentation. So firstly, any measure or intervention that seeks to change the behaviour of individuals and groups, and that's from the UK Better Regulation Task Force. Another definition, the sustained and focused attempt to alter the behaviour of others according to defined standards or purposes with the intention of producing a broadly defined outcome or outcomes. That's Julia Black. So the context for local government, the first thing that people sometimes forget, I'm sure ANZOG audience wouldn't, but that we're delegated. We have delegated functions that really rest with the state government. And that means we already have quite a defined and limited field with which we can act. And in Victoria, it's regulated largely by the Local Government Act, but there are also other legislative and policy requirements. So, for example, we're required to do a health and wellbeing plan for that. That's a requirement. So there's quite a bit of activity, regulation, etc., that's already set out for us. The other thing, we have much smaller budgets. Now, I know my colleagues in local government will balk at City of Port Phillip saying that we are an inner city council with some activity zones, some iconic destinations like St Kilda Beach, where that enables us to have other income streams that certainly are rural or growth area council wouldn't have, particularly parking, but also planning permits. And we have a substantial portfolio of real estate that earns us income through rent. But nonetheless, our budget's just limited compared with the big brothers and sisters of state and Commonwealth government. I guess the other thing, we have fewer regulatory tools. And the other thing, we're much more responsive and accessible to local pressure. So those of you who've worked in local government would understand that getting change through can be quite difficult. Government's very accessible, open meetings, timid councillors. So that's somewhat different context to other levels of government, same but similar. So we really have three broad regulatory tools or levers. Now, the first one, most people have received one of those things that make you happy when you come back, a parking ticket. So parking fines. So we are able to regulate through passing local laws with penalties. So we do have some coercion tools, predominantly parking, things like we've recently passed very contentious an alcohol ban during summer on the foreshore. But that's not our main means. We also have what I've called permission, where through a range of policy and intersection with acts, we're able to give people permission to do things or grant permits. And the two most common would be building permits. And here's an example of footpath dining, a permit. And particularly in my area, the next slide is the most common, and it's persuasion. Now, I'm not sure, I'm hoping people can see that clearly. One issue that we're dealing with at the moment is the reopening of the beaches. St Kilda Beach is an iconic destination. We're facing a real issue that with tourism closed and the borders closed, St Kilda Beach will become even more in demand, and we're desperate to manage the public health and safety issues, because if we don't do that, the alternative is the forced closure of the beaches, which would be a disaster for our hospitality and arts industries, which are the two main industries in the city as we reopen. And I think that's a cute example of regulation. We went down and drew circles on the foreshore, and people very obediently went and sat in those circles, and you'll see groups of 5 with appropriate distancing, complying with the public health order. So, and the persuasion toolbox is the main toolbox in my area. So what I'd like to do now is a specific example of how I've used persuasion, or how we've used persuasion rather, and the broad we, as you will see, to address a problem that is peculiar or peculiar in higher numbers to the city of Port Phillip. So homelessness is a general problem across the country now, unfortunately, in most areas. But rough sleeping in higher numbers is an issue that exists in fewer LGAs or local governments. So in Port Phillip, we've seen an increase in rough sleeping. That is people without shelter, sleeping on the streets, in cars or in parks. It's increased by 50% in the city since the 2016 census, creating huge community concern and division. So from a lot of agitation around why can't we move people on, there's a lot of reasons why we can't do that, but in terms of our toolbox, we wouldn't have the legislative power to do such a thing, even if it was a good public value outcome. And likewise, the other concern is voices very angry with the people who are wanting a punitive approach, and it's created a lot of division, a lot of angst. If we go through our resident information records for calls to council. Rough sleeping and complaints about rough sleeping has been one of the biggest issues for the city. At the same time, we have multiple state and Commonwealth funded agencies working in the city, receiving millions and millions of dollars, and we're seeing absolutely no movement. And that includes homelessness outreach and support services. Alfred, the big teaching hospital, with both a homeless outreach psychiatric service, as well as the daily presentations at the accident emergency of rough sleepers. A great community health service, Star Health, the police, ambulance, alcohol and drug services, mental health, the Aboriginal controlled agencies, Veterans Affairs, 10% of the rough sleepers are veterans. So there's a huge investment to getting no outcome. And at the end of the day, we're talking about 100 people approximately. So you would think with all that effort and spend for a problem that involves only 100 people, you should be able to get better outcomes than we're getting. We thought that was the case. So we looked at introducing what we're calling a collective impact approach. Now, I don't have time to go into collective impact, but it's an approach that's being used across the world to deal with complex, intractable problems. And it's a very different approach, and I will send some references to Chris, so if people are interested, you can get some references. But essentially, and in terms of measuring your public value, it's very straightforward because that's where it starts. So an example of a collective impact approach I saw in southern Los Angeles was that they aimed to improve the 5 measures of children in a area of 500 blocks in southern Los Angeles. So based on evidence, they see if we improve these 5 outcomes, that will provide better life outcomes for these kids. And it was things like improved start at school, their parents having a job, their parents speaking English. And that was what they focused on, and improving those. We focused on achieving functional zero. Rough sleeping. Functional zero means that the number of housing and support places is equal to or greater than the number of rough sleepers. Now we're a long way from it, and the biggest block obviously is housing. But the regulatory levers here are all persuasion levers. And I guess in terms of the strategic triangle, you cannot do that. The 2 capabilities and the authorising environment is where you focus on here. Your team and your staff have to have the capability to manage and build relationships, but you could not enter into a collective impact approach unless without the authorising environment of the players in the city, because there's no extra funding. So what you're relying on is the relationships, the incentives. A lot of the players are getting really bad outcomes in their funded programs because people don't have housing and they're cycling around. So there's an incentive. And the other lever we had was in-kind, use of our staff, our buildings for meetings, and a small grant of funding for 1 project officer. And we regulated this largely through MOUs. And as I said, we're able to do this because of the authorising environment that existed. Most people want to get on and work with local council. Most organisations at a local level have good relationships and want to have continuing good relationships with the council. And the other thing, in a collective impact approach, it's a high investment in relationships, building and maintaining, and in transactions. Now, when you see the next slide, you'll be horrified. This is the governance structure for Port Phillip, and I'll take you very quickly in the time that's got left. But you'll see, so if we go from the bottom, what we've created is a by name list. So we know at any point in time, every fortnight, that is updated. So we know all of the rough sleepers by name. We've entered into a whole heap of confidentiality and privacy arrangements to protect that. But it means, for a start, we know who they all are, and each one has a dedicated lead worker attached. We have a hotspots meeting every fortnight, and that's been chaired by Bernie Geary, who is a respected former Children's Commissioner. That's bashing heads together. So that hotspot is a client who's circled around for years and has really complex needs, or an amenity issue where there's a group set up and it's creating a whole heap of public amenity issues. That is to bash heads together, and not really in a nice way, but to get agreements and sign on to solve the problem. The rough sleeping outreach is where the outreach, people funding outreach, that's where they agree and report on the clients. And then the homeless service coordination is a shared case management resource. All of these, most of these people are known to multiple agencies. And so this is where we coordinate the service. So the next level up is a range of senior managers, and that's an escalation group. And so if a problem gets stuck down at that level, it gets escalated up. And all of the CEOs have agreed that that group, where needed, can escalate to me. So for example, in Port Phillip, to the head of police in St Kilda, in that area, to any of the CEOs or any of the leads to unblock a problem. The next one is our really big issue, and that's our big block, is housing supply. So our biggest block is that we don't have the houses to put people into. But having said that, the housing supply is looking at what other alternatives, what are the other things we can do to source other forms of housing supply. And then every 2 months, there's the executive meets, and that's really more strategic. And in particular, that looks at, I guess, advocacy and influencing up and out that needs to happen. So as you can see, it's very, very invested in relationships and managing those. So is it working? I'd love to say it's having great achievements. As I said, the big blocker is the lack of housing. Having said that, is that slide showing on outcomes? Yeah. So this was last week's by name list. So there are 125 people on the by name list who are currently active. Of those, 9 are in temporary stable housing, and in that fortnightly period, that was a decrease of 1. 68 are in respite accommodation. Now that's due to COVID, because the government has buying hotel, motel or service department rooms. That ceases in March. So we know that those 68, 70 will hit the system again. They'll be potentially become homeless again. But what the Port Phillip Zero does is that we know all of these and we're ready to work quite assertively to get them into housing. And the state government is now investing in housing options for these people. We still have 29 sleeping rough, and in the last fortnight there was an increase of 5, which is the biggest we've seen for a while. Seem to be coming in from outer suburbs mainly. Most of those have been offered, or some of them have been offered and have been in respite accommodation and fallen out. So at the moment, we can get anyone into respite accommodation if they need. 8 have been either hospitalised or incarcerated. 5 are unknown. That usually means they've disappeared. And, which is an amazing outcome, we got 6 into housing. Now, going back to when we started this, the best outcome in a fortnight was 1 into housing. And over the 6-month period, we got, I think, over the 6 months, we got 9 people into housing, into permanent safe housing. So it's slow slog, the biggest blocker is the stable housing, but we think if the stable housing was there, we would be moving much more quickly to functional zero. And it is based on evidence that has happened in other jurisdictions, in other countries that have been able to achieve functional zero. So I'm just got on time, so I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Tony. I really enjoy the focus in the micro case because you kind of illustrate how public value both has a big idea, though we can really take it down to the very applied local level, and how do you use this as a framework to understand both the action, but also the measurements you might take that action is having effect locally. So yeah, I really appreciate it. And having the two cases between yourself and Emily, I think we're seeing both a statewide analysis. Emily, and you talked about these royal commissions as authorising action. And I think what's interesting is these are temporary kind of authorities, aren't they? Because they do an investigation for a period of time and it's over, but they lend legitimacy to the subsequent action that might follow. And I think traditionally we've probably thought about the authorising environment as consisting of stable stakeholders or institutions, and not these sort of temporary elements that come in and sort of churn things up a bit and give authority for further action to happen by those key players that are there. So it's great to hear the two perspectives that you've both brought to it. We've got quite a few questions coming through on the Slido, but I just wouldn't mind, Emily, just if, you know, listening to Tony's presentation, is there anything that came up in that discussion that you feel that you want to just touch on before we go to the questions in terms of Tony's perspective on how the public value framework is being used in that context?
Yeah, look, I think it was really great to hear about another situation where you've got lots of actors in a space. And what I really enjoyed hearing about from you, Tony, was you've come up with a measure at the end. You may not be able to have that direct attribution of exactly which thing has led to those outcomes, but you are at least measuring all the parts around it, and you can show some results. So it's great that you can really, at the end of the day, come up with something which is really logical to try and illustrate your story.
Mm-hmm. Tony, is there anything you want to comment on, having listened to Emily's presentation and kind of thinking about the contrast between your own context? Because I get the sense your case is really focused on this collaborative relationship building, and in some sense this is about building the capability to address the problem. I know you mentioned the authorising kind of context, but it seems very focused on getting that collaboration across all those parties to recognise the problem and how they might take action.
Yeah. I mean, I was saying to Emily last week, because I've got responsibility for child and family services, including childcare. We have quite an intersection with her organisation, and we find it a really great organisation to work with. Yeah, a little bit jealous sometimes that you do have the big stick lever, and you know, so we've got. You know, sometimes it would be frustrating, it would be nice, but I think at the end of the day, you still, in my interactions with the organisation, it's still primarily based on assuming that people have a common goal to deliver that public value of reducing and child abuse and protecting kids. And I still think, whilst there's the regulatory stick, I would imagine a huge percentage of the effort of the Commission is focused on similar stuff to what I talked about, at a much larger macro level.
Okay. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Emily. Look, I might go to the questions that we have on Slido. So we have a question from Daniel. His question is, how might regulators demonstrate real impact and effectiveness when attribution to outcomes is difficult to apply? So, Emily, I think this might be a bit of a challenge in your own agency, this attribution to outcomes. Have you got a comment on Daniel's question, like how might regulators demonstrate real impact and effectiveness?
Look, it's such a good question. You probably know it, and those regulators in the room, you will know that case or that matter where you've made a difference. But how you prove it is really, really quite hard. I like to think about setting up multiple indicators. So if I'm looking at trying to demonstrate public value, I'll tend to grab a couple of different output measures. And often through grabbing things like that, you can start to map your contribution versus maybe another's contribution. Some of it's also about your storytelling. You might know it, but you may not be able to prove it. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't explain that. So be bold enough to assert where you think you've made a difference, even if you don't quite have the numerical evidence to prove it. It's not all about the numbers. Sometimes it's just having the boldness to actually out yourself and say, yeah, we made a difference here.
Tony, do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah. So look, I'm in the luxurious position at local government that I don't need to care about attribution. I'm caring about the outcome here, and I know that I can go to council and say that this project will eliminate rough sleeping over time, or that's the aim. And there's enough understanding, enough nuance, enough local knowledge with councillors that I'm not probably going to have the program defunded if it's not delivering that in a year. Whereas if a larger funded agency had that as an outcome and you weren't achieving it, it'd be more problematic. I think the key to the collective impact approach is that there are multiple agencies with different masters and different accountabilities, and we're neutral on that. We don't care about that. This is a group who've said, for whatever reason, that this group is getting together with one outcome, just one, and that is to, over time, get functional zero, get towards functional zero. I guess the only thing would be is if the measures, the reporting measures, conflicted. So if your funding agency measures conflicted with the aim of Port Phillip Zero, that would be an issue. It's not unthinkable that could happen, but it's not happening at the minute.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I've got a second question from Jessica Bandiera, which actually I think is a good one for you, Tony. It's about the co-regulators, like how do you demonstrate the work, things are done better? So the question is, any suggestions on how we can work better with co-regulators on demonstrating that we've actually did it, that we've delivered something of public value?
Look, it is really difficult, and as I said, these projects they're agnostic around the measures that the players are required to deliver in their funding stream. But the starting point, I would say, is that local government is probably the only level of government that can be actively engaged in a collective impact project on the ground. I think it's very, very difficult for state or Commonwealth governments because you don't have the local connections and local knowledge. You could fund such a program, but I think the key is to invest in the relationships and build the trust, so that it would be impossible to do something like this if you hadn't invested and you didn't have good trusted relationships and some permission to go outside business rules, traditional business rules, to get something like this happening. I think that'd be the main things I'd say there.
Thank you. Emily, do you want to add to this in terms of the co-regulators?
Yeah, look, one of the things that we're able to do is publish data, not just about our own actions, but the actions of other agencies in seeking to prevent child abuse. So in our annual report, for example, we publish not just what the outcome is from the Commission's perspective in relation to an abuse allegation, but also Victoria Police. We also publish some data on our interactions with working with Children Check Unit and also Victorian Institute of Teaching. Victorian Institute of Teaching publishes certain measures about the actions it takes. Working with Children Check does as well. So if all of the co-regulators you're working in are prepared to commit to publishing information and data about their parts, you can actually knit it all together. It does enable an evidence-based discussion then to be had.
Okay, thanks. I've got a couple of questions that are about better regulation. So they're about targets and moving away from the widgets measuring to sort of measuring meaningful public value. This kind of summed up in this question: would a public value approach possibly help regulators fend off the latest swing of the pendulum towards not just better regulation, but active anti-regulation? So it's this constant shift in, I suppose, regulatory measurement expectations and the way it shifts around. Would public value approach help regulators in sort of having a more robust justification of what they're doing? I'll go to you, Emily, first, and then to Tony.
BP3s I find interesting. For those who don't have them called the same thing in their jurisdictions, these are the measures that get produced in the budget papers, and organisations usually have to every year publish what they deliver on those measures. We're in a situation at the Commission where we actually don't have any BP3s, where we're so small as a regulator that we don't have our own. Certainly in other regulators I've worked in, they have driven me to despair sometimes at the effort that goes into recording those and how little connection there seems to be with the public value you're producing. I think I internally reconciled with myself that that's not the be all and end all of your public value story. If you see that as the pinnacle of it, you're missing what you need to do, I think, as an organisation, and that is you have a website, you have an annual report, you have the media, you have all of these avenues to get across what you do. And if you're just focusing on that one avenue over there through BP3s, you're really missing what you need to be doing. Yes, I think at the end of the day, the better you can demonstrate the good that you do, the more balanced a conversation is going to be in terms of the need for a regulator. It's something that needs constant attention, though. You can't think that if you do it once a year in a big splash, that's going to maintain your legitimacy as a regulator. You have to have relationships with members of the community to make sure that you're still in touch with what they actually want from you as a regulator. You need to be going to those people in the community who have had that problem. So in the case of the Commission, our engagement with victim survivors is incredibly important. Our engagement with parents and parents groups, incredibly important, so that we understand what they actually want from us. So you've got to look at all of the spheres and telling a cohesive story constantly, not just once a year in your BP3.
Thanks, Emily. Tony, do you want to make any comment on these measurement issues?
Yeah, I think starting with public value is fundamental. Look, the beauty of a collective impact approach, you start with the whole thing is about a clear measurement. So you start, the aim is to do this, and that's the only measure. So it's very clear, but it's very, very important to argue what the public value is and to demonstrate the public value in that measure. And a lot of, with rough sloping in the city, it was equally an economic measure, a social cohesion measure, as much as a measure for improving the devastating impacts that it was having on the individuals. So it was causing incredible conflict in the community as the city changed, as newer populations came in. It really was creating a lot of conflict. It was having an impact on Fitzroy Street. For those of you who know St Kilda, Fitzroy Street had died, and that was a lot of that, rightly or wrongly, was being blamed on rough sleeping. I think that's a much more nuanced discussion than that. But solving the public value and I guess the authorising environment, that was fundamental to us doing this, that there was huge public value in a very broad sense. And I think it's the only way you're going to get the arguments through to do something like this, and the buy-in from all the players that is required to do it.
Thanks very much, Tony. I'm conscious of the time. We've reached our hour and I need to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone who contributed to the Slido questions, and I apologise we weren't able to get to them all. We have quite an extensive list of questions there, but I think I've tried to cut through them and amalgamate some of them so that we're covering some of those answers. But a lot of questions there, Tony and Emily, about outcomes, measurement, you know, the enduring challenge of how do you focus on kind of identifying what's of value and the tension between that and other measurements. So look, Emily and Tony, I really appreciate the work that you've put in the preparation for this webinar, and I'd like to thank you. Thank you very much for your contributions.